Hi TYB, welcome to your second snapshot in the book of Mark. How are you going? Are you exhausted? Do you feel like, oh my gosh, Jesus, like one of the students, could you just slow down and be in one place at one time? Jesus had a mission and he knew he had 3 years to proclaim the good news, set the captives free, heal the blind. It's so incredible, this book, because you feel like you're there. Have you heard the language of immediacy and this sense of action? Can you feel that? Now, written about 50 to 70 AD, and as I said in the first snapshot, this is a big block because we really don't know when this was written. Tradition says, and most scholars believe, that it was the first gospel written. So we are only about 20 years after Jesus had died on the cross and rose again. We are in the time of Paul. Paul didn't die until 64. So Mark wrote this in the time of Acts. Mark wrote this. Does that blow your brain? Mark wrote this in the time where Paul's on his missionary journeys. He could have. He wrote this in this time where he knew the gospel message was needed. He knew that somebody needed to write what happened. And you know, this beautiful story, what's happening in this time in the church that Mark is so passionate about writing this gospel. What's happening in this time is about AD 54, Nero. And you've heard me mention Nero probably a couple of times now. But Nero was I can't think of a better word, but a very harsh, almost psychopathic emperor. He would burn people, burn the Christians at the stake while he had a party underneath them. Just horrific persecution. Now, he is accused at this time, the Christian community, of setting the city of Rome on fire, which in fact history and tells us that he actually did it, possibly. And thereupon, this persecution instigated this campaign against the church. At the time, you know, he ends up killing Peter and Paul, martyred, and in the setting of the persecuted church where they're living under constant threat of death. You know, we read Mark 8:34, you know, whoever desires to come after me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. And we read that and go, yes, Lord, I'm taking up my cross. They would have read that and gone, yep, he's exactly right. I need to be martyred for Christ. Take up your cross means get on the cross of crucifixion and die for Christ. So we read that in our context and we don't get the sense. When you read that in the historical context, Mark is saying if you have to do what Jesus did and go to the cross to that point, then Jesus did it before you, you can do it. How sobering is that for our Christianity? Now, as I said in the beginning, the prologue, the program of this is this good news sense. It's still got a good news sense, which is beautiful, that the suffering servant Jesus did this and rose again. It's not just about dying for Christ. He's saying, you know what, if you do get to the point where you have to be martyred for Christ, you will rise again. There is this beautiful sense. Now, the crazy thing is, Mark doesn't actually put the resurrection in his gospel. It's a really odd ending. Now, we know that sense. We know now that he rose again. We know now that because we've got Luke and all these others. But, you know, for us, that resurrection would be the sense of, you know, I'm going to die for Christ and then rise again. But when you have a look at Mark, he actually doesn't go that far. He actually says this. He says the death of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, and then it says Jesus has risen, and it's this really short text. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Solomon, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone, and he does actually mention it. Don't be alarmed. You are looking for the Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He was not there. But can you see there's not this full account of that you see in the other Gospels of what happened after and all the accounts of him walking on the road? It's not there. Do you know why? Because he's not focusing so much on the resurrection and on what happened after. He's focusing on this suffering servant. He's focusing and he's pushing you through. Now, how does he do this? We are going to have filming in Australia. You probably can hear this. Can you hear this kookaburra? Don't you love filming in Australia? We've got the beautiful animals around us. Now, Mark's structure of the Gospel. It is structured around the geographical movements, which are climaxed by Jesus' death and then the account of the resurrection. After the introduction, we then have Mark narrate the public ministry of Jesus and his action-packed, as I said, in Galilee. And you're going to feel this. Grab a map on Google Drive, grab a map and actually follow him through. Follow where Jesus is going, because he's going to stay in Galilee from in chapter 1, and then it pushes through and he goes to Judea. So in Galilee from 1 to 9, and then in Judea, and then he goes into this culmination of Jerusalem, and he goes into Jerusalem. So you feel this geographical push towards Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the place where this suffering servant, this servant of God, this beautiful Jesus is about to go and die. He is going to take this to the end. And when you think in the light of the history of when this is being written, he's saying this: no matter what Nero does, if you have to die as, I mean, they're being martyred, being put on poles with, set alight. If you have to do that, do it, because Jesus walked all of this time to his death. Now, this is the shortest gospel. You are going to find no accounts of genealogies or, going into the birth or anything. He jumps straight in. Remember I said action pack? When you go to those movies and you feel like you haven't kind of breathed, and it just starts straight away. There's no, this is the story or this is the account, nothing. This is Mark. He starts straight away and he finishes abrupt. It's this sense of graphic, striking phrases. It's this sense of immediacy, all the looks and gestures of Jesus. So you feel like you're right there when Jesus looks at this, and you get this language of the action of Jesus. Now, let me read this. If you're getting a bit confused about this book or anything like that, then again, I recommend the Tyndale. Now, this one's a little bit different, I have to say. As I go through, I try and recommend some commentaries, and I look at commentaries that I like. Now, this one's a bit different. It doesn't go through author, date, background. It does, but it goes through some really great topics, and the theology behind it goes through Son of God. We're going to talk about that in the next snapshot. So when you read this one, it's a little bit different to the other Tyndale ones that I've seen and read, but this one I would recommend. If you are academic and you want to go into word studies, outheos, what does immediately mean, then this is an academic test. Now, you can see it's quite intense. So don't pick this up if you're just starting. It will freak you out. This is a word biblical commentary. These commentaries go into word for word into the Greek, and it's a great way to study it. Okay, now, if I was writing to a church that was being persecuted and I wanted to show them Jesus is the example of the person who suffered and died for them, then here are some things that he does in the text. He writes to fortify their faith in danger of being overwhelmed by fear. So he talks about that in chapter 4:41, in chapter 10:32, and 16:8. He talks about having faith that can face anything, no matter what happens, and don't go to fear. He talks about the present circumstances of believers in 10:29 and 9:49. He admonishes them that Jesus' behavior under severe trial and suffering that is a standard for us. When we suffer persecution, we read the Gospels and we go, you know what? He did not react. He did not get angry. He didn't start throwing things at them, which I would have. He just was beautiful, and it just makes me cry under severe persecution and how Jesus acted. This is why we read the Gospels. We want to know how he acts and reacts in circumstances so we can copy that, so that we can do that. To encourage them to, despite their failures, despite their trials, Jesus never disowns his disciples. They're up and down, and promises a beautiful relationship after his resurrection. Prevent believers from being deluded by end-time delirium. Don't you love that? In other words, he's saying, guys, he wants them to see the heavenly reality through their earthly disasters. He's saying, look, this is the reality. I know you're suffering. I know you're going through persecution, but you will rise again. To fit Christ followers for the mission for the world, he's activating them again. And then he talks about this beautiful sense of Jesus, that he plants Jesus as a real person firmly established in Palestine life. That's why he uses locations, because they were in these locations and they were going, oh my gosh, he was here and there. He's writing to the church in Rome that is being persecuted by Nero under threat of walking away from Christ, saying Christ the Messiah suffered as you will suffer and are about to suffer, but he endured and he rose again. Be encouraged by this book. Keep reading it, and we'll see you next snapshot.